They called it impossible. A 476-ton minesweeper, slow as a trawler, and armed like a patrol boat, threaded through a sky owned by Japanese bombers and a sea sown with searchlights by pretending to be a jungle. If a commander is given 12 hours of darkness, a coastline of reefs, and a crew willing to strip the nearest islands bare, can a warship truly become a tropical island and slip past a conquering fleet? Keep watching. Later in this video, we will answer the one question most historians dodge: what single mistake would have exposed the ruse in minutes and doomed everyone aboard? Late February 1942, the Allied American-British-Dutch-Australian command shatters in the Java Sea. Rear Admiral Carroll Dorman's striking force dies hard, outgunned and out-torpedoed by cruisers Nachi and Haguro, and a screen of veteran destroyers. Within 48 hours, a second calamity, Sunda Strait, finishes the work. HMS Perth and USS Houston, battered and short of ammunition, blunder into an invasion convoy and are torpedoed under flares, while Japanese shells rake the water crimson. The route to Java's beaches is pried open. The Japanese army steps ashore. To stay at anchor is to wait for bombs. To flee by day is to invite them. To live, small ships must vanish. Wikipedia Psukwunwan. Among the remnants at Surabaya is a stub-nosed Jan van Amstel class steel minesweeper HNLMS Abraham Crijnssen. She is no Greyhound, length just under 57 meters beam under 8. 2 Yarrow boilers feed triple expansion engines that push her at best to 15 knots when the sea is kind. 1 3-inch gun sits forward like a clenched tooth. 2 20mm Oerlikons flare at low-flying planes. Racks of depth charges line her stern. Crew about 45. In a sky ruled by reconnaissance, seaplanes and Ki-27s with destroyer divisions prowling the straits. This is not a fighting ship. It is prime wreckage, unless it becomes something else. Sea Power Center, Puplum 1. Command passes to Lieutenant Commander A. van Miert, a man with too little fuel and no margin at all. After Java Sea and Sunda Strait, the order is brutal and simple. Withdraw to Australia or destroy your ship. 3 sister vessels make ready: Jan van Amstel, Peter de Bitter, Elan Dubois. Panic gnaws the harbor. Crews watch, oil tanks burn. Code KPX get out, crackles through the chaos. On the quay, Van Miert chooses a third way: not speed, not firepower deception. Tracesofwar.com. The plan is indecently bold. By day, Abraham Crijnssen will not be a ship. She will anchor hard against jungle-edged coasts' engines, cold her deck and low silhouette, smothered in branches cut from the nearest islands, her mast broken with nets, her remaining hull painted mottled gray-brown to mimic limestone and shadow. The crew harvest saplings, palms, shrubs. They lash fake shorelines along the gunnels. They drag a frond-hung tarpaulin across the bridge to kill the telltale geometry of men and rails. If a pilot circles, he must see a small, nameless islet in a sea that holds thousands. At night, the disguise comes off enough to breathe. Anchor is hove short. The island moves. Hug the reefs. Outrun nothing. Outthink everything. Wikipedia. +1. The Japanese net is not notional. Since December, naval land-based air has learned the brown-green grammar of these waters. Sasebo seaplane tenders and shore stations fan E-8N and E-13A float planes across the Madura and Bali seas. Destroyer flotillas, fresh from slaughtering Allied cruisers and driving depth charges into oil slicks, comb the exits. The safe route south to the Indian Ocean narrows to 2 through the reefs and straits east of Java, or across open water beneath eyes that rarely blink. Deception is not a flourish, it is survival math. Wikipedia. March 6, 1942 night. Surabaya astern. The minesweeper slides out under blackout through Sunda Strait last in a line of hopes. Two sisters, Jan van Amstel and Elin Dubois, lack thorough camouflage short of fuel and men. They huddle at Gili Raja. Van Miert refuses the company of bad luck. Abraham Crijnssen creeps farther, anchoring instead by Gili Genteng, then spends the daylight working like field hands, replace wilted leaves with fresh, adjust the shore, repaint scuffed rocks. They are gardeners with a deadline. When sundown bleeds across the shallows, the island stirs and goes. By morning, the caution proves wise. A Japanese aircraft spots the unprepared pair. Elin Dubois is scuttled. Jan van Amstel, finally disguised, flees, only to meet destroyer Horatio and die in Sunda Strait. And the minesweeper's first day of deceit has already saved her life. Tracesofwar.com +1. Progress becomes a ritual anchor, tight under the lee of real land at dawn blend. Move at nautical twilight. Never silhouette against open horizon. Choose lanes where coral teeth will scare off destroyers running fast. North of the Kangean Islands, on March 8th, she takes water and coconuts on the sly checks. Rumors no Japanese here for 4 days. The crew studies local vegetation and corrects errors. Wrong leaf shapes show up from above. The palette is everything. Each dusk, they trim their island with a decorator's malice, then nudge east or southeast Kangean to the Bay of Potopadu on Sumbawa, then into the narrow throat of Allied Strait between Lombok and Sumbawa, where currents grip and any spark on the water will hang a neon arrow over the deception. Engines hush. Speed drops to 10 knots to save fuel. The ship breathes only when the reefs do. Tracesofwar.com. The gamble pays. By March 11th, the bow bites into Indian Ocean, swell the first clean horizon since Surabaya. The camouflage becomes drag, now a wet parachute that thirsts the cold bunkers dry. The crew heaves the jungle overboard, watches palm crowns slide under in the phosphorescence, and turns for the northwest cape of Australia. They keep the coast close enough to taste salt on Rock Run. At economical 10 knots, skip obvious harbors in favor of distance. Shark Bay passed, Dirk, Hartog Island, ignored the log open on the mess table, reading fuel left against miles to go. Tracesofwar.com. No one in Geraldton understands the miracle when she appears on March 15th, an ugly little vessel, engines, hot crew, salt-stung and unslept, last survivor of a division. No one yet calls her a museum ship. She is fueled and watered like any tramp, then pressed south to Fremantle, arriving March 20th. The masquerade is finished. The war is not. In Australian yards, sailors fit Aztec to her bilges, repaint her honest gray. By September 28th, she wears a new prefix, HNLMS Abraham Crijnssen, and sails again this time as an anti-submarine escort and submarine tender, a working ship in the long Pacific convoy grind. The island has become a hunter. Tracesofwar.com, +2 library.museum.gov.au +2. But here's the tease promised at the start, what would have exposed the disguise in minutes. Not a careless leaf or a mist gray patch. It was heat. Japanese airmen were trained to read the ocean's breath-wake, ripple the geometry of motion. An anchored island that bled warmth into still water or trailed a faint wake in a glassy dawn would betray itself before a single palm turned yellow. How von Miert's crew tried to solve that, how they froze their island each morning, comes later in this film. Night makes the rules. The sea accepts them without debate. In the first hours after clearing Surabaya, discipline hardens into a routine that reads like a survival algorithm. Choose a coastline dense enough to bite, sound the bottom. until coral teeth rise under the keel anchor with no slack, so the hull cannot swing and betray geometry. Throttle every fan and vent that sends a plume of warm breath into cool dawn air and bury steel under green. A working ship becomes a landscaping crew. Branches are measured against sight lines from above. Trunks are cut to break the gun's silhouette. A tarpaulin darkened with mud and oil soot runs from bridge to bow to erase straight lines that aircraft are trained to spot. Nets hold a fringe of scrub along the rails to mimic a tide line. Smoke is non-negotiable. Anything that burns must wait for night. The minesweeper's boilers are nursed like patients fed just enough to bring up head of steam by nautical twilight and never earlier. The clock-knot courage decides when to move. Its Japanese reconnaissance patterns set the tempo. Float planes sweep wide arcs from tenders lashed into newly seized anchorages. Land-based bombers know the morning air like farmers know wind. Dawn patrols squat low and slow. Mid-morning legs widen to cover convoy lanes. By early afternoon, the search turns mean sun, high glare white. Every wake writes like chalk. Above all of it hangs a lesson learned over the Philippines and Malaya. False shapes abound on water, but motion is a confession. The island must be a patient liar. To survive daylight, it must look like a feature that was here yesterday and will be here tomorrow. That means no ripples against the lee shore, no anchor chain singing in a gust, no gulls startled into the air by the wrong smell. The crew hangs fish off the stern to attract birds. They smear the tarpaulin with crushed leaves to kill the mineral reek. The deception is not a single trick. It is a collage of small obediences to the grammar of the archipelago. The geography is a second enemy and a second ally. Java bleeds into a maze of reefs, lagoons, and straits that reward slow courage more than fast bravado. A destroyer at 30 knots fears coral one error and the bow opens like a letter, so the channels close to the reef lip become sanctuaries for those willing to thread them at 10. The minesweeper's shallow draft, once a design compromise for sweeping minefields, in estuaries becomes a passport. Every night run is plotted to exploit that advantage. Creep along the seam where surf breaks in a constant mutter. Ride the back eddies that curl behind spit and shoal. Keep the moon on the wrong shoulder, so the silhouette blends with the cliff's midnight. Lanterns are forbidden. Even luminous paint on a compass card is hooded with a rag. No one speaks of luck. They speak of tide tables and bearings and the exact angle at which a palm crown looks like a rock shelf from 500 feet. The technical burden is relentless. Camouflage sheds water and gains weight. By midnight, the ship wears a sodden poncho that drips and drags. Each dawn, men are sent ashore in the skiff to harvest replacements fronds with the right rib-pattern vines that drape rather than spike shrubs that grow at the shoreline so their presence on deck will read as plausible. Wrong botany is as deadly as wrong geometry. Paint is rationed to patch the mottling that imitates sun shadow on limestone. The forward gun receives particular attention. Its shield becomes a cliff face of canvas and sap. The barrel line is broken by a forked branch that throws an irregular shadow. The mast, the great betrayal, is sawed to a stump and netted then crowned with dried leaves to pass as a crooked tree. Below all this performance, the boiler room makes a quieter transformation. Insulation, wrapped tight blowers, gagged ash carefully bagged and weighted, so no telltale flecks drift off like black confetti and mark a track. Food, water, and fuel recalculate the risk every hour. There are no friendly coaling stations. There are islands that do not care why a ship thirsts. Where the charts show a village or a fish trap, the minesweeper does not anchor. A rumor or a warning could outpace any speed she can make. Water is stolen from streams at night with hoses filtered through canvas sacks stuffed with sand and charcoal. Coal is husbanded like ammunition. The chief engineer runs the engines at a miser's notch, keeping pressure steady and revolutions smooth so the prop wash does not foam. Every unnecessary knot spent tonight is a mile surrendered tomorrow. The math is cruel, and clear disguise buys daylight. Economy buys distance. Distance buys an ocean where a small ship can lose herself in honest weather rather than cunning. Radio silence answers the temptation to call for help. Somewhere south are Australians ready to refuel anything that floats. Somewhere north are destroyers that arrive faster than regret. Every set aboard is dark. The only signals are in the sea itself, the timing of a move that aligns with another patrol's blind spot, the acceptance that a squall line can hide an hour's run if entered at the exact minute when rain erases contrast. Weather becomes an ally to be negotiated, not commanded. A tropical downpour is a curtain. A clearing sky is a glare that strips the island bare. The crew learns to read cloud bases for hints of how the air will look to a pilot. Low ceiling means compression of ranges, an invitation to hug shoreline tighter. High cobalt means a merciless clinical view from above a day to become more rock than leaf. The Japanese fleet's momentum is the backdrop pressure. Convoys push down from the north under fighter umbrellas. Cruisers cast long shadows across the straits. Destroyers, lean and rested, hunt for stragglers to finish the work. Listening watches bring back the hard facts of conquest. Distant gunfire, hammering a coastal battery flares over an anchorage that once belonged to merchants. The low, mournful, heartsick sound of a ship taking its last air into her lungs before the sea shuts them. Cutting the engine to let the hull go dead silent during those moments is not theater. It is respect and arithmetic. Noise is a currency spent sparingly. The deception matures into a doctrine with 3 pillars. First, kill the straight line. Ships are grids. Nature is fractal. Every railing must become ragged. Every angle, if it cannot be erased, must be softened by shadow. Second, obey the literal. An island is part of a shoreline context. Anchoring the island out in blue water would be like hanging a painting in midair. The mask must sit against a frame. Third command, the thermals. The sea at dawn is a mirror to any heat source. This is where the ruse comes closest to cracking boilers asleep still leak. Ghost warmth through plates and seams and warm water moves differently than cold. The crew experiments with a primitive thermal discipline. Open sea chests to circulate cool water. Through the hull, at anchor, lay seaweed mats along the waterline to create a thin insulating layer, and when wind permits, rig canvas skirts into the water to trap still water against the hull, where it will equilibrate rather than flow. None of this is perfect. All of it buys minutes. And minutes under a searching float plane can be the difference between a lazy second pass and a strafing run that tears the camouflage down to honest iron. There is a moment each day when the performance is most fragile, the first turn of the screw at dusk. The ship must move without announcing it. The anchor is catted in small increments to avoid the clank that carries over flat water. The engines are brought up inside their own noise so the beat does not leap suddenly into the night. The helm answers as if coached in a whisper. A faint wake silvered by the last light would write their sin wide. So they move in the hush between bird calls when diurnal feeders settle, and nocturnal hunters have not yet flown. Once past the reef, lip speed rises to the planned 10 knots, never more, and the log reads like a steady heartbeat. No panic, no bravado, only distance earned. Every mile down the chain changes the search problem for their hunters. Out of Surabaya, the Japanese can anchor their grid on known Allied routes. Past Kanjayan and Sumbawa, the probability map stretches toward Australia and the Indian Ocean, and the target space dilutes. Yet the danger stiffens at choke points. Alas Strait is one, Lombok Strait another. Here, currents run like rivers in flood, and a ship that pretends to be an island by day must become a navigator by night, with no room for error. The minesweeper uses her sweepsman's DNA lead lines over the side, a feel for the bottom that says more than a chart ever can, and an instinct for the way water talks when it is skimming a shelf only a ship's length wide. In those hours, the camouflage is irrelevant. Steel and seamanship hold hands. Propaganda cannot follow into such narrow water. On both sides, it works in headlines and posters, not in the hiss of a reef 3 meters away. Japanese claims of invincibility and Allied promises of gallant stands go silent, where a helmsman must decide whether to trust a faint smell of reef at starboard or a chart that says 5 fathoms under the keel. War brings nations to the strait's mouth. Survival reduces everything to a pilot ladder, a coil of hawser, and the angle of a moon that can either betray or bless. And still the question hangs over every daybreak, what mistake would have killed the ruse in minutes? The crew senses it in bone. Not a leaf out of place, not a paint chip shining. Something older, more indifferent. It will be named in full later. For now, they treat morning like a confession, and daylight like a court that accepts only perfect pleas. Currents write their own cartography. In Alice Strait, they carve rivers inside the sea, a muscular flow that humbles engines and exposes any lie that moves clumsily. The minesweeper approaches on a moon that is little more than a bruise riding the backwash off Sumbawa's spine to keep the propeller's bite buried in turbulence no pilot can decipher at dawn. Land port is a knuckled wall. To starboard, a stepping stone chain of rocks that in daylight draw pearl divers and in darkness collect wrecks. Here the deception learns to cooperate with hydrodynamics. The helm holds a crab angle into the set, not to keep a neat track, but to avoid a wake that slides sideways like a pen stroke across still ink. A straight, feathered line behind the island would prosecute the case for metal. A smudged, broken eddy that agrees with the reef's own scribble dissolves suspicion before it can be framed. The chart says depth, but the sound says voice. The ship listens to the reef's syllables and answers in kind, 10 knots falling to 8, then rising to 10 again when the water loosens its grip beyond the throat. Timing is the only aggression allowed. The last half hour before astronomical twilight is consumed by closing on a lee so tight that the anchor chain lies not down but upslope like a climber's rope. Tension converting steel geometry into the immobility of stone. Overhead reconnaissance doctrine is recalibrating to its own victories. With ABDA smashed, patrol arcs expand from convoy escort to interdiction. Float planes nose along shorelines like pointer dogs, trained to recognize the unnatural luster of paint, the planar tyranny of decks, the unvegetable rhythm of stanchions. Yet the pilots are also taught the economy of war fuel is rationed, hours are logged, and every circle must justify itself to a hand that fills in grid boxes back on a tender. The island understands bureaucracy as a layer of defense. If its first impression is plausible, it earns a bored glance rather than a hunting orbit. That is why the crew spends an hour each dawn adjusting the language of the disguise to the day's light edges, softened with wet leaves because humidity will sharpen contrasts. a darker smudge painted along the bow because the sun's angle will otherwise throw an honest, deadly highlight. Sand and crushed shell dusted on tarpaulin to kill a sheen that would look like varnish. The camouflage is not a sculpture, but a daily dialect. News of other ships is a geometry lesson written by fire. Somewhere behind Elin Dubois boils herself soft to deny a prize. The smoke is a column, the glow a verdict. Jan van Amstel argues with destiny for a day, then loses to a destroyer that has speed sonar and torpedoes designed to erase distance in the time a prayer takes to rise. The minesweeper's survival's not braver. It is better fed with information. Fishermen's lanterns placed in a pattern that only locals use tell where a current breaks. Crab pots clumped in a cove mean a sandy bottom and poor holding ground. A beach with drift lines of specific seed pods implies a vector of prevailing wind that will shift gust patterns at noon. The crew becomes literate in small coastal scripts that navies drunk on ordnance often ignore. Weaponry remains both meager and decisive. The 3-inch forward gun concealed as Cliff is trained inboard each dawn so that if the mast tears in a sudden squall, the silhouette will not scream warship at a passing eye. The Oerlikons sit under a scab of net and vine whose weight clogs traverse if rain pools in the mesh. Gunners learn to lift the fringe and swing by, feel rehearsing to the clock, uncover, engage, kill, recover, every motion ending with camouflage restored. Depth charges lightened with careful bleed of explosive. An ugly compromise are kept as last resort for a submarine that attempts an opportunistic surface gun attack in the night lanes. Most nights they are only ballast and threat. Ammunition is counted in quiet. The fight, if it comes, will be measured in seconds and leaves no room for second shots. The Japanese torpedo, the oxygen-breathing, far-running idol of night battles, has little to say here. Its virtues sing in open water at speed. In reefs and threads and mirrored dawns, it is an opera star asked to whisper. But the destroyers that carry it are disciplined, and discipline hunts well in any geography. Twice the minesweeper hears them, a low mutter of turbines down a strait where the reef lip prevents them from cutting the corner. A searchlight prying at a lagoon where a rumor said refugee craft hid. The doctrine of not moving during suspect hours proves more ferocious than any counter-battery. Stillness is invisibility when the hunter is impatient to close with a different target further down the map. Logistics compress the day into acts. Act 1, harvest. The skiff goes ashore with knives and a painter long enough to recoil. The cutters move fast because every minute near a village is an invitation to be noticed. They learn to take young leaves from the shaded side of trees. Sun-burnished fronds look like polished metal under a pilot's eye. Act 2, construction. Nets are relaced, tarpaulin stretched and pinned canvas rock repainted with a slurry mixed right in a bucket with sand and ash. Act 3, silence. Engines cold enough to stop convective thermals. Galley fire transferred to a sand-filled tray on the stern, screened by a double wall of wet sacks, flame blue and invisible. Canned rations preferred on bright days because any smoke threat is an advertisement. Act 4, observation. A rotation of lookouts with field glasses scans not for ships, those are noisy and theatrical, but for the mundane betrayals, a line of foam that runs wrong, a bird flock that lifts an alarm far out of scale with a fish school, a flash that can only be glass on a cockpit. Act 5, departure. The anchor is broken out inches at a time at the moment the first cricket chorus fades and before the first island dog answers the night. Engines answer at quarter speed, then half each gain like a heartbeat, returning after a held breath. Only then does the timetable relax and distance begin again. Outside this corridor of fear, the war broadens. North of New Guinea, a different ocean prepares to measure fleets against each other. In the Bay of Bengal, raiders test the definition of sea control. In the Indian Ocean, convoys will soon knit Australia to everything she needs to fight. The minesweeper's arc intersects this larger map once she breaks into open water. The disguise, once a skin that secured survival, becomes a parasitic weight. The sea demands honesty in swell. The crew peels their island back into the element that gave it watching green sink to black, and the ship rises half a foot, a resurrection measured in freeboard. Now the calculus adds barometer and horizon. Without reef cover, a rain squall is not a curtain, but a lightning magnet. A clean skyline is both freedom and exposure. Their only defense is to be uninteresting, a small wake, a steady course, a speed that suggests a coastal trader rather than a warship that has escaped a killing ground. Signals discipline anchors the next passage. No wireless, no code lamps, no flares. Even in extremis, they gamble on remaining a rumor rather than a contact report. The sea repays such humility with indifference, which is mercy by another name. Days stretch. The modest engines, nursed within 10 revolutions of an ideal that converts coal to miles with miserly grace, mean every noon the log reads like plain prayer answered 60 miles, 63 miles, 58 against a head swell. They pass the longitude of Shark Bay and choose not to enter, because protection attracts curiosity. The coastline to port is a ribbon of ochre and scrub a continent that looks back with the blank gaze of safety, just out of reach. Men let their talk return in small currencies. Coffee allocates itself without officers. The wash deck party becomes a ritual that reclaims skin from salt. Discipline relaxes enough to permit a song hummed under breath, quickly smothered at any glint on the horizon. The reveal, the dangerous answer promised, but not yet paid in full, sharpens in this wider water. Heat was the invisible betrayer. The crew's crude thermoregulation held until an element they could not command threatened to undo it. In one stroke, a glass sea at dawn under a temperature inversion, when warm air caps cold, and the ocean's skin reflects like a drilled parade ground. On such mornings, even a hull asleep bleeds a thin line of difference that a trained eye bored and thorough can read. There was one dawn like that, a float plane low and lazy, a circle tightening the camouflage, perfect and useless on a sea that had no room for imitation. Why it passed on, and the one additional practice, more audacious than cooling intakes with raw seawater, that finally solved the problem for the remainder of the run will be explained in the next segment, where deception meets physics in a trick that seems like superstition until it works. Dawn under an inversion writes in glass. The float plane found them there, a low altitude turned cautious and exact. A pilot educated by victories to distrust ease. The camouflage was immaculate and useless on a mirror. The water around the hull read fractionally, warmer, no plume, no smoke, just a faint smear where boundary layer and hull had argued through the night. The circle tightened. The answer came not from paint or leaf, but from physics. Two actions, ruthless and inelegant, snapped into sequence. First cold circulation hours, before first light, the crew had opened sea chests and driven raw seawater through condensers and intercostals until the hull plates carried the night's chill like a stored commandment. That morning they went further, deliberately flooding selected voids and one near-empty coal bunker to turn steel into a cold sink, accepting a few inches lost in freeboard for a skin matched to ambient sea. Second, a reef drogue, a raft of palm trunks and bamboo threaded with seaweed, paid out astern on a long painter broad enough to eat turbulence and break the linear grammar of a wake into the irregular scribble of a tide line. The floatplane bored in saw confusion, where it expected a signature, widened its arc in irritation, then moved on to a more obvious target inland. The lesson fixed itself. Heat and geometry betray while cold and chaos absolve. From that morning forward, the ritual was codified. 3 hours before astronomical twilight fires, banked low and the circulation pump took the watch. Canvas skirts, already mentioned as insulation, were extended as a submerged curtain along the waterline, pinned with lead seam weights to create a still pocket that equilibrated in temperature and texture. The raft, heavy, wet, stubborn, was not always towed. That would have been conspicuous. It was deployed only at anchor on glass mornings, tethered tight into the lee where natural weed lines collect, presenting itself as one more strand in the littoral's messy handwriting. Experimental measures were tested and discarded. Coconut oil bled in droplets did indeed kill cat's paw ripples, but left a dull sheen that from certain angles looked exactly like what it was, a film that did not belong to an untouched shore. That superstition was punished and retired. Silk clouds proved better. In the odd cove with muddy bottom, a careful stir from the skiff seeded the water with a faint brown that hid small differences under a general sameness. The point was not invisibility, but plausibility, the art of never giving a bored eye a reason to become a hunting eye. The open ocean accepted no rehearsals. With the island peeled away and the hull chilled to honesty, the minesweeper turned miles into a defensible asset. The discipline that survived reefs translated into convoy arithmetic even before she joined one. Engines were kept at a narrow band where coal to mile was near theoretical optimum. Helmsmen were instructed to minimize unnecessary rudder inputs because every degree of yaw writes an energy waste and throws a curl of foam that can be seen farther than a hull. A 2-watch system of lookouts was retained even in clear water because complacency at this stage kills with the pettiness of irony. The first Australian fishing smacks they passed were given a wide berth. Curiosity is contagious. Sailors stripped the last of the crushing vegetation, scoured decks clean, and restored the honest silhouette of a warship that had nothing left to prove to the archipelago. Geraldton took her in on March 15th without ceremony. The war there was measured in manifests and hoses. Coal trucks and water tenders are the quiet heroes of rescues the public never hears about. By March 20th at Fremantle, yardmen, with the practiced economy of those who know what the next months will require, worked her over for a new trade. Aztec domes touched steel. British pattern sonar sets, practical temperamental lifelines found homes below the waterline. Depth charge rails were rewired and repaired. Throwers calibrated to pattern, not panic. The forward 3-inch, so recently, a cliff face painted in slurry was stripped and overhauled until breach action sang. The camouflage green was sluiced into scuppers and replaced by a neutral gray that reflected a different kind of discipline. Be ordinary in a convoy until violence requires you to stand out. Recommissioned as HMAS Abraham Crijnssen, at the end of September, she entered a theater that had redefined urgency. Submarine threats along the west coast of Australia were intermittent but not imagined. The doctrine for an escort of her size and speed was strict keep station on the threatened quarter. Run sonar almost continuously in low-noise bands, answer contacts with laddered patterns that use charges like punctuation rather than script. Never outrun physics, an escort that sprints into false ranges leaves geometry open behind her like a door. Her sweeper's DNA persisted precise station-keeping feel for shallow water, the calm confidence of men who have threaded worse. Equipment changed the character of risk. Where once survival had rasped against coral teeth and searchlights, now the enemy spoke in narrow, constricted sounds beneath thermal layers. The same attention to thermals that had saved them on the Mirror Sea became a weapon. Escorts that understood temperature gradients hunted better. The minesweeper's sonar team learned to read layers not as obstacles but as traps. A contact that faded under a layer could be reacquired by a brief throttle up and a new aspect then prosecuted, with charges walked down slope like a careful staircase. The raft and the skirts were cutaway history. In their place came kites and paravanes, signal flags and convoy numbers chalked on stern doors, a new routine of painting whole numbers, large enough that a nervous merchant captain could count them in squalls. There were contacts attacks and the event that every escort dreads because it indicts days rather than minutes a convoy casualty. Not her charge, not under her quarter, but a ship she could see and therefore remember, torpedoed at dusk a boiler room hit that folded the vessel in two honest pieces that stayed afloat, long enough for boats to be manned. The minesweeper's speed was no longer irrelevant. At 15 knots, she could not chase a submerged threat down, but she could sit on the wound like a dressing sow charges in disciplined patterns that kept a shark from circling back for a second bite. And after the first shock of loss, she could restore order by example. Convoys live on order. It is a different courage from deception, but no less exacting. The old disguise repaid itself one more time in a surprisingly bureaucratic way. Intelligence officers hungry for methods that did not rely on tonnage or tide of battle lifted the island doctrine in pieces, not the theatrics of branches, but the habits that support deception, fuel economy as a strategic choice, thermal discipline as a way to inhabit the 5 meters of air and water that betray the preference for context over spectacle. In the North, atoll hunters and coast watchers read those lessons and wrote them into their own playbooks when hiding something, hide it inside the environment's own logic, not as a costume, but as an extension. Warships learned night silhouettes. Landing craft learned to smell their beaches for the same signatures. Weed lines, silt stains, the believable mess that resists the clean lines of industry. The promised answer is now complete. The single mistake that would have doomed the ruse was moving steel through glass at dawn, any rotation of the screw in the wrong light, any untimely exhalation of boiler warmth into still water. The counter was not clever paint or bold bravado, but the humility to let physics lead chill the mass until it belongs, interrupt the wake until it reads like tide, and only then accept motion when the sea begins to speak again in ripples. That truth belongs as much to convoy work under gray southern skies as it did to a mine layer's escape along green ropes of reef. The ship that had been a garden now served as a metronome in columns of freighters, a drab, steady beat that promised predictability in a war that burned it for kindling wherever it found it. Performance turned into procedure. Terror became competence. A miracle retold in mess decks was replaced by log schedules and maintenance cards signed in grease pencil. Yet beneath the painted numbers and convoy signals, there remained the memory of a coastline that defended a ship not with armor, but with the grammar of its own shape, and a crew that learned to write in that language until a hunter turned away. What survives from an escape becomes a procedure others can inherit. The minesweeper's ledger, once a list of tricks born of necessity, translated into a quiet chapter of naval doctrine. Deception is not costuming, it is context control. Thermal discipline is not theory, it is survival in the first 5 meters of air and water. Economy of motion is not timidity, it is an attack on the enemy's search math. In the months after March 1942, those principles echoed far beyond one hull. Coast watchers threading canoes along hostile archipelagos borrowed the cold water idea to mask cooking fires beneath wet rock overhangs. PT boat crews, blamed unfairly for splashes seen at dawn, experimented with silt curtains in mangrove creeks before idling out. Even aviation units learning to hide scarce aircraft from Satellite Island's brand-new reconnaissance routines matched camouflage to the exact botany of their runway margins and laid decoys not as caricatures, but as believable clutter. The wider war, adjusting to a world where radios and radars began to redraw every coastline, still admitted that the human eye could be deceived by a humility that obeyed nature rather than shouted at it. The minesweeper's story and the telling of men who prefer numbers to myths settled into a crisp equation if searchers rely on signatures. Remove signatures. If signatures cannot be removed, drown them in noise that belongs. Inside convoys, the disciplined smallness that had once saved a life became a promise for others. A merchant captain, standing his dusk watch, found reassurance in a low, unshowy silhouette, holding the threatened quarter with compass needle reliability. Signal lamps, when fog shredded columns into lonely lines, spoke in a polite vocabulary that calmed nerves, two short, one long station-keeping, as lullaby rather than command. ASDIC pings rolled out of the minesweeper's hull with a metronomic regularity that infected the rest of the screen. Panic sprints gave way to shaped hunts only when contact plots justified them. In heavy weather, she took green water over the forecastle with the stubborn dignity of a vessel that had already survived reefs and darkness. Waves are loud, but they are honest. On one bitter day, a merchantman late to form cut across the screen. A junior officer, fresh from a larger ship where tonnage forgives clumsiness, expected whistle and rage. He received instead a course correction, 6 degrees to starboard, a flag hoist that read steady as a hand on a shoulder, and then silence. Convoys are made safe by 100 refusals to escalate. War is not only the courage to fire, it is the discipline to remain ordinary until precision is required. In the Indian Ocean, where storms write geography anew and horizons promise distance as their only charity, the minesweeper's speed could not chase submarines to the kill, but her intelligence could deny them comfort. Sonar teams learned the grammar of layers like a second language. A fading echo might not be a submarine slipping away, but a thermal seam refracting sound. A suddenly bright return might be a thermocline lifted by a squall's downdraft. Depth charges were walked down slopes instead of thrown as tantrum. Their patterns tuned to bathymetry, because the enemy lives in 3 dimensions and dies in 2 when forced to choose the wrong vertical escape. Once, when a contact tried to hide beneath a convoy by sitting under the fattest target's wake, the minesweeper's answer was geometry. Her slow speed allowed a hover that kept pings at the correct aspect, while a faster consort looped wide to drop a laddered pattern. The end was not cinematic. No oil slick rose, no air burst, bubbled to the surface like a visible confession. The convoy moved on with an invisible problem converted into an unproved absence, which in escort work is sometimes the maximum justice available. The mythmakers, never sleeping, polished the tropical island into an anecdote designed to make listeners grin at war's absurdity. A photograph of branches on steel, a one-sentence caption about fooling the enemy. It fits in a coffee table book, where victories are curated into palatable amazements. The truth, less photogenic and more valuable, lives in the interstices between action reports and weather logs. The crew did not beat the Japanese because a palm tree on a gun shield is inherently comic. They beat a search system by vandalizing its expectation of straight lines by cooling mass until water and metal stopped arguing by collaborating with reefs and thermals rather than challenging them to a contest of speed or volume. That lesson survived propaganda's appetite. It entered the toolkit of people who would never meet each other, because Dutch sailors, Australian yardmen, American convoy commodores, islanders who knew the weed lines where real islands shed their skins, Japanese pilots who would later admit in diaries that boredom was the ally of the hunted more often than luck. After the war, the minesweeper's log acquired another kind of quiet. She returned to a Navy that needed workhorses more than legends, saw further service without theatrics, and at last was allowed the indignity and grace of retirement. Steel that had once worn trees learned to endure schoolchildren's shoes and museum placards. Guides developed their own ritual, less dangerous than gardening a disguise at dawn, but kin to it, of pointing a finger at a crisp right angle and asking audiences to imagine it, vanish beneath vines of inviting a hand to rest on a hull plate and consider the difference 5 degrees of temperature makes to a tuning eye. In Den Helder, where the air often carries the clean salt of a North Sea that has no patience for tropical stories, visitors stepped across a gangway into a space that had been both prey and escort and found the detail that matters. This is not a story about a trick. This is a story about respect for an environment powerful enough to kill and generous enough to hide, depending on how it is asked. There are other legacies written in places where ships cannot go. Special operations units contemplating insertions along hostile coasts later in the century stole from a minesweeper's wartime notebook without apology. Heat discipline under canopy became a pre-mission checklist item rather than a superstition. Low-contrast movement at nautical twilight became a prayer, said with timers and patience rather than bravado. The habit of asking what the environment wants you to look like before choosing what you want to look like survived into wars whose maps did not resemble Java or Sumbawa in any way that would matter to a pilot in 1942. The specific leaves and paints faded. The cognition did not. The single mistake that would have killed the original ruse moving hot steel in glass dawn remains in metaphor, the mistake that undoes the clever in every theater impatience in the moment when the world is most reflective. And the Japanese fleet, a phrase that in 1942 occupied minds like a weather system, recedes here to its appropriate scale, not a mythic beast, but an organism, with organs that can be confused, routines that can be spoiled, and doctrine that can be taught to chase phantoms just long enough to miss what matters. Cruisers and destroyers did what they were built to do. Pilots flew arcs that matched fuel to area with frightening efficiency. The tide of conquest broke against enemies measured in divisions, not fronds. Yet for a handful of nights along reefs whose names seldom make it into grand histories, a small ship rewrote the rules in the only way that can humble a machine by refusing to be the kind of thing the machine is trained to find. What remains on the deck today, paint rivets a gun polished by hands. Thinking of visitors is the honest evidence. But the invisible inheritance lives wherever men and women look at a coastline, a thermal seam, a mirror sea at dawn, and ask first, what will this surface say about me if I move? That question is the opposite of cowardice. It is the grammar of survival, married to the ethics of not demanding spectacle from moments that demand discipline. The answer paid for with knives and vines and buckets of ash and hours of cold water in steel is that restraint can be as aggressive as any torpedo if it is pointed into the physics of the hunt. So the hook from the start can be closed without flourish. If a commander is given 12 hours of darkness, a coastline of reefs, and a crew willing to strip the nearest islands bare, can a warship truly become a tropical island and slip past a conquering fleet? Yes, provided that the theater for the performance is chosen by the sea, that heat is treated as loudly as smoke, and that every motion is priced against the attention budget of a bored eye. The mistake that would have doomed them was impatience against a mirror. The discipline that saved them was a willingness to become uninteresting until the world stopped reflecting so hard. If you want more war as physics stories, more operations where survival hinged on reading the environment like a code book, make sure to subscribe, leave a comment with the next campaign you want decoded, and share this with someone who still thinks camouflage is paint deep.